Seattle. Rain pounded against the towering glass panes like the impatient knocking of a god growing tired of waiting. Julian Vance stood frozen in the middle of the conference room on the 87th floor, his shoulders pulled taut like steel cables. Outside, the city was drowning in damp fog and blurry headlights. Inside, sweat beaded at his temples and slid down the collar of his already soaked dress shirt. This wasn't a conference room. It was a giant glass cage, and he was the animal on display, moments away from execution. On the wall, a digital clock ticked down with icy indifference 01:26:13. In less than 90 minutes, the delegation from Sora Dynamics, a Japanese aerospace giant, would walk through that door. The $500 million contract for Odyssey would be decided in a single meeting. A brief conversation or a death sentence for Vance Aeronautics. Julian turned his eyes like frost, cutting toward Elena, the veteran interpreter he had once personally recruited. I said, integrated development, not modular deployment. Do you not understand the difference? Elena didn't answer. She simply reached into her bag and pulled out a small item, a bamboo keychain etched with the word Nintai Patience, a gift from Julian himself 3 years ago. She set it on the table, said nothing, and walked out. The door clicked shut, with a dry, final snap. Julian stood there, fists clenched, until they turned pale. No interpreter, no deal, no future. He closed his eyes, and like an explosion in his brain, memories crashed in. A tiny room cluttered with overdue bills, a disheveled father frozen in front of a glowing computer screen, saying nothing, just staring with the hollow eyes of a man who had died from the inside out. Julian's eyes snapped open, chest heaving. No, he whispered. I'm not him. I've come further than he ever dreamed. But a voice curled in the back of his mind. Or maybe you're just on the same path, just haven't hit the final curve yet. He looked around, the lavish room, walnut walls, LED screens hidden behind frosted glass, the 10-year vision board mounted with pride. All of it is meaningless if he couldn't even secure a translator this morning. All those sleepless nights, the broken relationships, all of it, just to end the same way he did. He muttered, his voice cracked. The ticking filled the silence. Tick, tock, tick, tock. He stepped closer to the window, staring into his own reflection. But in the misty glass, he didn't just see himself. He saw his father's disappointed eyes staring back. Julian's face turned pale. Outside, thunder roared. The storm was coming. Sarah, find me a translator. Anyone. Triple the rate. No 5 times. Julian shouted into the office intercom, his voice cracking with panic. The once luxurious conference room had become a trench in the middle of a battlefield. The cold digital clock kept ticking down 01:03:51. Sarah, his ever-loyal assistant, was sprinting through every contact list. Each call was a bullet, fired into the last flickers of hope. I'm sorry, they're at an international conference in Bellevue. Fully booked. This one's in San Francisco. No way they can make it in time. Every time Sarah hung up, her eyes grew more desperate. She clutched the phone, fingers trembling. Julian paced the room like a caged animal, no longer a powerful CEO, but a man drowning inside the very fortress he'd built for himself. The chorus of no, no, no echoed around them, merging into a painful symphony of rejection. I don't need perfect, Julian roared. Just someone who understands Japanese culture and doesn't make me look like a clown. Sarah said nothing. She had reached the final name on her list. Julian grabbed his personal phone and searched for a name he'd cast aside long ago, Professor Lawrence Myers, who once mentored him in a course on international business culture. The call connected. Professor, I know I used to— Mr. Vance, the voice replied sharp and icy. As you once told me, academia is for people who aren't good enough to do it in the real world. Funny seems like today you could use a little academia, couldn't you? Click. The line went dead. Julian stood frozen. Not because Myers was wrong, but because he was right. He looked around. The lavish room, with its gleaming mahogany table, Italian crystal lights, and a $200,000 abstract painting, offered no help now that he had no one to speak for him. He could buy the city of Seattle if he wanted, but today he couldn't buy a single hour of a skill he once dismissed. A minute passed in dead silence. Julian sank into the leather chair. The conference room felt like a mausoleum. Outside, the rain drummed on the glass like a funeral march. Tick, tick, tick. The clock ticked on without mercy. Julian shut his eyes. No ideas, no solutions. Nothing left but the fear of ending up like his father. Then ding. Sarah looked up, a faint spark in her eyes. There's someone, but she didn't get to finish. The glass door behind them swung open. A soft female voice called out coffee and pastry delivery for Vance Aeronautics conference room. Julian didn't bother looking up. Just another interruption. But Sarah froze. The woman walking in carried a silver tray, hair pulled back, rain-soaked coat clinging to her shoulders, but her eyes weren't those of an ordinary delivery worker. Maya Rivera set the tray down with the care of a craftsman, each cup of coffee aligned, each pastry placed with precision, as if the meeting still had a sliver of hope. Julian didn't look up. His head rested in his hands, eyes vacant and glued to the floor. Sarah glanced at Maya, ready to send her away, but then paused. There was something different. Maya adjusted her bun. A strand of hair still clung to her forehead from the rain, and stepped back. Then she heard it. A faint murmur. All that work, just to become a failed copy of him. Julian whispered, barely audible. Odyssey deserves to be understood. Omoshiroi. Maya froze. Excuse me, she said gently but clearly. In what context are you using the word omoshiroi, sir? Julian lifted his head, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. You know Japanese. Maya pressed her lips together. Just a bit, she said modestly. But if you're trying to make a good impression with Japanese partners, you might want to use Kiyomi Bukai instead of omoshiroi. It's more formal, and it conveys depth. And if you use the Sonkigo form, they'll feel more respected. The room went still. Sarah looked at Maya like she'd just conjured something out of thin air. Julian leaned forward. Say that again. You said Kiyomi Bukai, yes. Omoshiroi just means interesting. It can sound a bit casual. Kiyomi Bukai implies deeply engaging. For someone like Mr. Tanaka, word choice reflects the mindset. Sarah let out a quiet breath. Julian stared at Maya like he'd found an escape hatch in a sealed chamber. Maya blinked, as if realizing she may have overstepped. I'm sorry if I spoke out of turn. I just thought maybe I could help. Julian tilted his head, studying her. Soaked sneakers, faded jeans, calluses on her left hand. But her tone calm, confident, and her eyes didn't belong to a typical delivery worker. What's your name? He asked. Maya Rivera. Where'd you learn Japanese? Georgetown University. I used to work for the State Department, she replied, keeping her voice steady. East Asian relations. Julian straightened up. Why are you delivering coffee? A pause. Then Maya met his gaze head on. Because my mother has stage 3 cancer, and medical bills don't wait. No one said a word. Sarah swallowed hard. Julian nodded, not out of pity, but because for the first time that day, he saw someone else fighting just as hard not to fall apart. He turned back to the table and opened the presentation file. His hand trembled slightly. No other options. No time left. He looked at Maya. "Can you translate this?" Maya stepped forward and picked up the document. The first page was a technical brief. Her eyes scanned rapidly through terms like thrust vectoring composite payloads and modular deployment. She frowned. The term modular deployment might need revision. In Japanese culture, it can suggest incompleteness. Julian's mouth fell open. "Then what do I use?" Maya gave a faint smile. "Adaptive integration. It sounds proactive, flexible." Silence. Then Julian exhaled as someone pulled back from the edge. "Who are you really, Maya Rivera?" Maya quietly flipped to the second page of the document. Her eyes moved swiftly without hesitation. Every line of technical jargon, from aerodynamic recalibration to failover protocols, was processed as if her brain had handled this language 100 times before. Julian stared at her like he was witnessing the impossible. "You actually understand all this?" Maya nodded. "I used to translate military cooperation documents. Drone tech isn't unfamiliar." Julian folded his arms, leaning back against the table, but his expression was clouded. He wasn't sure if he was asking out of curiosity or out of hope. "A literal translation won't cut it," he said hoarsely. "I need someone who gets how the Japanese think, how they listen, how they interpret every detail." Maya looked up. In her eyes was the fatigue of someone who hadn't rested in weeks, but also something else, the calm of a person used to standing on the edge between diplomacy and disaster. "Then I understand. I don't just translate words. I translate intentions." Julian turned to the control panel and typed rapidly. The printer spat out a technical briefing nearly half an inch thick. He grabbed it and placed it in her hands like he was handing over the weight of the entire company. "Translate this. 30 minutes. If you can do it, I'll pay you $10,000 for the next 90 minutes. She froze. 10,000 enough to cover a few months of treatment? He asked, not with pity, just plain truth. Maya stared at the stack of papers. Her fingers tightened around it. She had once worn suits, once stood inside embassies, once spoken to consuls, but now soaked in a delivery uniform, she stood at the threshold of redefining who she was. "I'll do it," she said so quietly, only Julian heard. Sarah immediately shrugged off the blazer she was wearing and handed it to Maya. "Put this on. Mr. Tanaka doesn't need to know where you came from." Maya nodded, slipping off her wet delivery jacket. Underneath was a simple white shirt. She pulled the blazer on, swept her hair back, and stood tall. She was no longer a coffee runner. She was a diplomat stepping back onto the battlefield. Julian looked at her and gave a small nod. "We've got less than 60 minutes. "Then let's not waste a single second," Maya replied, eyes locked on the document. The clock ticked again. Tick, tock, tick, tock. But this time, it wasn't counting down to failure. It was the heartbeat of a new plan taking shape. Click. The glass doors opened. A gust of cold air laced with the scent of rain swept into the 87th floor conference room. 4 Japanese men stepped in. Dark suits tailored to perfection. Not a wrinkle, not a wasted word. Leading them was Kaito Tanaka, a living legend in the aerospace world, feared for his unnerving composure and unshakable code of honor. He stopped in the center of the room, set down his leather briefcase, and scanned the space. His gaze landed on Maya, the young woman in a borrowed blazer, standing beside Julian. Julian swallowed hard. Maya stepped forward, bowing deeply with both hands neatly folded before her in traditional Japanese etiquette. "Kange itashimasu," she said in flawless Japanese voice, soft as air, but firm as steel. "We are honored to welcome your esteemed delegation to Vance Aeronautics. No one replied immediately, but one of the directors raised an eyebrow. The man beside him gave a subtle nod. To Maya, those tiny signals, each blink, each breath, spoke volumes. They were paying attention. Julian glanced at Maya. He didn't understand her words, but he felt it. The room had shifted. She gestured to the seats. The group settled in. The air now stretched taut like a violin string. One wrong note, and the entire symphony would collapse. Julian began his presentation. His voice was low and composed. For the first time that day, he didn't feel alone. Maya stood beside him, document in hand, eyes tracking every slide. Each sentence Julian delivered, Maya translated not mechanically, but as though each idea was being reborn in her language. Julian spoke about Odyssey, its precision, its speed, its tiered architecture, enabling drones to adapt to diverse terrain. Maya interpreted not just the words, but the spirit. Her phrasing carried the nuanced reverence Japanese culture prized far more than any statistic. It was like watching a duet unfold. Julian spoke, and Maya echoed. Julian stepped toward the model display, and Maya followed, synchronized like two musicians playing the same concerto. And then Mr. Tanaka raised a hand. No words. No need for them. The room fell dead silent, as if the sound itself had been sucked out. Maya froze mid-sentence. Julian blinked, his throat dry. Is something wrong? Tanaka slowly opened his briefcase. He pulled out an aged document, yellowed with time. The faded logo of Vance Aerospace, the company Julian's father had built and destroyed 2 decades ago. He laid the folder on the table, then looked up. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were sharp, surgical. "Before we sign anything," he said slowly in English, "we would like to know, why is your Odyssey different from your father's failure?" Icarus silence, utter and complete. Julian stood, frozen. Maya held her breath. One question, but it carried the full weight of a past he'd spent his entire life trying to bury. Mr. Tanaka's question echoed through the room, slow and deliberate, like a verdict being read aloud. "Why is the Odyssey project any different from the failure called Icarus, your father's failure?" Maya stood frozen. The documents in her hands trembled ever so slightly. Julian was rigid, paralyzed. The air in the rooms thinned like someone had sucked the oxygen out. Maya glanced at Julian. He was staring at the aged folder on the table, the faded Vance Aerospace logo blurred with time like a ghost surfacing from the depths. I think we should return to the technical specifications," Julian finally said, forcing out the words. But his voice cracked. No one responded. Tanaka didn't move. Maya took a deep breath and began to translate. But when she reached the phrase, "your father's failure," her voice involuntarily softened, as if offering an unspoken apology. Julian stepped back. His hands clenched beneath the table, knuckles pale. His jaw twitched uncontrollably. In his mind, the sound of rain outside shifted, morphed into a familiar whispering. That Vance kid, his father's company, went under. Remember, lost the house. Lost everything. Reputation too. Genius, please. Like father, like son. He was 12 again, standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching his father sit motionless in a sea of debt notices. No tears, just empty eyes. And the wedding ring already removed and laid on the table. Julian snapped back, gasping. "My father's project has nothing to do with Odyssey," he said, slicing through the silence with a voice sharp as a blade. "They belong to different eras, different men." Maya turned to him, her brows subtly furrowed. Tanaka remained still, hands folded, waiting for a lie or for the truth. Julian continued, voice louder now, trying to bury the tremor underneath. He was overconfident. He skipped audits. He believed in belief more than in data. "I'm not him. Odyssey was built with math, with logic, not with some romantic dream. He looked at Maya, waiting for her to translate. But she remained quiet. She hadn't just heard the words. She felt the fracture beneath them, the pain straining beneath the logic. Julian clenched his fists. Maya, what are you waiting for? Maya slowly bowed toward Tanaka, then began translating. Every word, just as Julian had said. But her voice lacked its usual edge. It carried a quiet hesitation. When she finished, silence took the room once more. Julian swallowed hard, bracing for Tanaka's reaction. But the Japanese executive looked only at Maya, then back to Julian, saying nothing. This wasn't a test of technology, it was a test of character. Julian didn't realize he now stood at the edge of collapse, not because of the Odyssey, but because of how he faced his past. Maya understood. She knew this moment couldn't end here. She placed her hand gently on the edge of the table. Her gaze shifted from Tanaka to Julian. For the first time, she was preparing to translate, not with language, but with her heart. Julian stood, frozen, heart pounding, like it might explode. One thought screamed through his mind. Did I just ruin everything? Maya remained silent. Her hand rested gently on the table, her palm tightening just slightly. Then she drew a deep breath and made a decision. Mr. Tanaka, she began in Japanese, but this time her voice wasn't just that of a translator. It was the voice of someone who could see the human being inside the armor. Mr. Vance does not deny what happened to his father, she said. On the contrary, he carries it with him like a scar, not to display it, but to remember. Julian frowned. That wasn't what he'd said, but he didn't stop her. The Odyssey project, Maya continued, is not just about technology. It's an effort, not to run from the past, but to learn from it, to say, I saw what my father left unfinished, and I will complete it, not out of pride, but out of honor. The room held its breath. One Japanese director gave a small nod. Another tilted his head slightly. Tanaka remained still, but his eyes had changed. Julian didn't understand Maya's words, but he could see their faces. And more importantly, he could see her. She was no longer standing beside him. She stood between him and the past, becoming the bridge he hadn't dared to cross alone. We understand your concern, Tanaka-sama, Maya said, bowing gently. But please understand, failure is not a shame if it becomes the soil where something better can grow. Silence, complete and heavy. Julian stepped forward, his eyes locked on Maya. He whispered, "What did you just say?" Maya didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him softly and nodded. A nod full of trust, as if to say, "You told the truth. I just translated it with my heart." At last, Mr. Tanaka moved. He placed his hand on the table, stood up, and looked Julian in the eyes. No smile, no applause, just a simple phrase in Japanese, "Arigatou gozaimasu." Maya translated, her voice trembling slightly. He says, "Thank you." It felt like someone had pulled all the air from Julian's lungs, but this time it was a relief. He couldn't speak. He just exhaled and collapsed into a chair. Maya took one small step back, her eyes still fixed on Tanaka. The Japanese delegation stood and bowed, slow, formal, profound. A bow is not for the technology, but for the man who had bowed first to his own pain. They left in silence. The door clicked shut, and all that remained was Julian Maya, and a victory that wasn't signed in ink but in understanding. 6 months later, sunlight poured through the curved glass walls of the Vance Aeronautics Testing Facility, a place once heavy with anxiety, now bathed in light and belief. In that space, a prototype of Odyssey soared across the test sky, graceful, precise, like a promise fulfilled. Julian stood beside Maya, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on the drone's every move. "You finally scrapped the whole modular deployment bit, huh?" Maya asked, half teasing. Julian smirked. "I didn't scrap it. I learned to call it by the right name." Maya nodded. Her gaze wasn't just on the sky. It stretched beyond it to her mother, to a past that once felt like an ending, and toward a future she'd never dared to dream of before that day. She no longer wore a borrowed blazer. She was now the director of global strategy, not out of pity, but because she earned it. "Odyssey isn't just a machine anymore," Julian said quietly. "It's proof. Proof of what Maya asked. That's what's been broken, can be rebuilt, better, stronger, if we're willing to look at the roots." Maya smiled. "If we have someone willing to understand." The moment between them needed no further words, no forced emotion, no lingering glances. Just two people standing side by side, witnessing something far greater than either of them. A new future, born from old fragments. The camera pulls back. They stand small within the vast room, but solid, steady, like two pillars rising beneath a changing empire. The Odyssey drone climbed once more, catching the golden sunlight. It wasn't an ending. It was the start of something new. If this story moved you about redemption, second chances, and the power of empathy, subscribe to Toch Story today. We tell stories like this, ones that touch your heart, stay in your mind, and maybe, just maybe, change how you see the world. Toch Story, where the stories find the real you.